The technical complications that I just went through in order to try to go live truly know no bounds. And that is all part of the universe's plan to get me in the right stage of frustration and depression to talk about one of Jane Austen's best novels of all of her novels, which are all great, entitled Persuasion, with the critically acclaimed, the narrator, it wasn't, um remake that Netflix just put out this week. In short, we're talking about Netflix's Persuasion, and we are live to do so. Thank you for suffering through my run on sentence with just the grammar that would make your English teacher cry. Kate, welcome. How are you this week?
I'm good. I'm really good. How are you?
I've never been better, clearly. I just fought a war with, Google Chrome, Stage 10, OneDrive, and God knows what else. And I won. So fantastic. We are here to talk about Persuasion mostly, but there were several other things that we watched this week, which I'm pretty excited to talk about. Only Murders in the Building kind of tops out that list. I also marathoned through the entirety of the latest season of Umbrella Academy. I just started Virgin River, the latest season. And if you haven't heard of it and haven't watched it, you're not alone. Nobody's watching it, and it's awful. And there's several other things that I've been watching, reading, etc. this week. But before we dive into all of that, Kate, we should start with the news. Take it away.
I didn't come with much news, but I thought it would be a prime time to kind of mention that DragonCon is just right around the corner. It starts on September 1st, and both me and Cammie will be there, and we're super excited.
I'm so excited. I am so excited to talk about that. Well, there's several shows that I'll be talking about or attending panels, speaking on panels, blah 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 that weekend, movies, etc. Spoilers, so will Kate, and it's her first year. Everybody say congrats, Kate. I just can't wait. It's gonna be fantastic. I have not figured out my cosplay sitch yet, but I feel like we'll be fine. Worst comes to worst, I'm gonna be a sexy minion. So let's just hope it doesn't come to worse. Other
I
news this week, obviously, we had San Diego Comic-Con in the
mhm.
last, I don't know, week or whatever, and a bunch of trailers came out during that time, including a Lord of the Rings Amazon Prime series trailer, which I watched and felt like I had just watched the entire series. Literally no secret stone, etc. left unturned in that trailer, and I also felt like it was 30 minutes long, but, kudos. Plus a bunch of other stuff. Marvel dropped their, what's up next in the next 50 financial quarters, thing. So that'll be really exciting. Black Panther stuff. Great, fantastic. I'm really excited for DragonCon though.
Yeah, I feel like I got so much Marvel stuff this weekend that I forgot all of it.
Yeah.
So I
Literally
forgot
in
to
one
write
ear,
everything
out the
down.
other, and a
Yeah,
lot of it
exactly.
forgettable, except for Black Panther, which I'm sure will be fantastic.
Yeah. The only other thing that I've heard from, I think it was released at Comic Con, but if not, it was released around the time, is the new Dungeons and Dragons movie because I am here to represent that sector. And there is a roaring rumor going around. It is a rumor, so don't take it as credit, but that certain people in the big Dungeons and Dragons space, specifically Critical Role cast, will be as like surprise little extras as cameos, and that would be hilarious to see.
I'm sure
But
they
I don't
will
know if
be.
that really
Like,
would
imagine
happen.
making a Dungeons and Dragons movie and not including the people who are
Yeah,
currently the forefront celebrities, and that's like I don't even know Dungeons and Dragons like that, and even I know that. So I'm sure they'll
yeah,
pop up.
yeah. Because it'd be one thing if they weren't so closely associated with the Dungeons and Dragons IP, if it was just like they were general tabletop, but they are so closely like connected. They work with, they publish books and literature like with Dungeons and Dragons and their owners. So the idea that the IP is being leased out to make this movie and the associated celebrities that are connected to it are not also involved if possible. It seems like a very legitimate and unrealistic rumor to hear. So
Absolutely. Also, Chris
yeah,
Pine's going to be in it. Also, does anybody else feel
yes,
like Dungeons and Dragons is a tongue twister, or is that just me with a speech impediment? Who knows?
yeah. I had several hard times trying to say that.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
Well, I hear the streets just call it D&D, so maybe we can do that.
Yeah.
But we're here to talk about something so much cooler and so further away on the nerdy scale. I don't know why it was phrased like that. Here we are.
Mhm.
And that's Persuasion. Netflix's Persuasion. Just as popular as, the worldwide franchise Dungeons and Dragons, if not more so, featuring Dakota Johnson. Now, for context, we I may have a slightly biased positive opinion about this for two reasons. Reason number one, everybody in the entire world hates it, and I really love being obstinate. It's such a juvenile, cringy characteristic, but I have it, so I'm here to be contrary. Reason number two, I watched it under great conditions. I got to watch it with my sister and with Kate and her cousin. It was so cute. Everybody say aw, aw. We got to all watch it together, so it was great. But
Yeah.
I really did come out of it, despite all of the reasons I had to be biased towards this movie, with some genuine, dare I say, logical basis for why this movie is not as bad as everybody thinks it is. And then maybe even some empathy with the opposing viewpoint as well. In the chat, Stormy says, "Hi, ladies. Hi, Stormy. Did you watch Persuasion? Let us know what you thought. If so, Kate, how about you kick us off on the Persuasion chat? Can you give me your initial rating and your initial thoughts?"
I watched, and I too felt like the staunch criticism was a bit harsh. And I kind of give it like an 8 out of 10. Is it perfect? No. Is any Austen adaptation ever going to be perfect, the exact representation of how I visualized it when I read it? No. But it's a really fun interpretation. There was a lot of great things that I think they did very well. Uh, Brought a new perspective, a new way of considering the story, which is kind of how I always view Austen, is you reread it just for a different chance to catch something new. But it does have some things that could have been improved, it could have been done better. And for the most part, the things that people are so critical of, I think they could have done what and still use that shtick. They could have just utilized it better. They honed it down in it in a sharper way. I think it would have been done to a greater effect. And I think that's why there's so much criticism. Is because the challenging things that were done in the movie were probably not done to the best effect, and therefore people just don't like it at all.
I think that a lot of the criticism initially leveraged at this movie that I saw were all examples where they took a beautiful line or a beautiful paragraph or a beautiful scene or whatever from Persuasion, and they translated it to this adaptation, which, while still set in Regency era and has all the trappings of Regency whatever, is frequently translated in the context of some sort of like quippy self-depreciatory joke, or some sort of kind of like a either jokey or just kind of quick snappy dialogue of some sort that doesn't at all reflect the flowy, lengthy nature. So, a great example of that is the if you're a 5 in London, you're a 10 in Bath, and like there's like, or Bath, or however I guess you would say it, what it's
Mm-hmm.
Bath, right? With an American
I think it's
accent.
Bath with an American accent,
Okay.
Bath with an English accent.
It's BATH, so I guess it's Bath. I don't know. Anyways, they have all of these kind of silly, quippy jokes that otherwise summarize like an entire chapter, right?
Yeah,
I found almost all of that to be really gratifying, really fun, really smart, really silly, and it kept things at a high pace such that, some of the criticisms you have, for example, if you contrast the 2007 Pride and Prejudice against the, what is it, 1995, whatever, I think it'd be fair to say that the 2007 one is much more popular than the 1995 one or whatever it is. And I also share that opinion. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they captured the essence of the book, but they did it in a more
Mhm.
appropriate, like pacing, and there's better crescendos and falls across the scenes and so on. And it just doesn't drag on as long and it leaves you wanting more. And I feel like this, in a much, kind of sillier way, does the same thing. But if you're just contrasting the book to the movie, then the movie does take out a lot of that and then modernizes what's left. Stormy has some questions in the chat, and I would like your opinion on them first. Stormy first says, I haven't seen it. Would it be smart to read the source material before or after seeing it? And she also comments, and I agree with this. It seems a lot of people can't just dislike something, they have to loathe it, voicing that opinion loudly. I quite agree. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, we in our viewing party, we had a member that hadn't read it, and she seemed to really enjoy it without any foreknowledge. So, if you don't want to read it, or you just really want to see it now, go ahead. But I really liked it knowing, because the things I did know that were differences, it didn't make me feel as if it was disrespecting the Austen material. It just kind of was casting a new light, showing some different aspects of it. And it actually kind of, in a weird way, highlighted my favorite thing about Austen, which is the comedy. My favorite
Mm-hmm.
thing is how well she uses comedy to talk about the realistic hardships of Regency England and life as it has always been, and relationships, both familial and romantic, and even like friendships and things like that. It's done, if not quite to the same caliber as in her novels, to a degree that is nothing to kind of roll your eyes at. I think even if it changed some of the themes and tones a little bit in translation, it was done intentionally, and it still did it in such a way that you get the point of the novel, you get the character growth, you get the commentary on their relationships and on these people's journeys either
I'm
way.
glad you brought up the comedy because I want to touch on that. This movie itself obviously is categorized, it's essentially a romantic comedy. And one of the criticisms that I saw leveraged against this is that this movie is funny, whereas the book is one of Jane Austen's most depressing books. And both of those things are true. This movie is funny. And I think, the worst thing that could happen is if a movie's trying to be funny or have some comedic effect and like that doesn't land, and there's like you're calling the movie a comedy and you're like, wow, I didn't laugh once. So at least people did laugh, like at least people are finding
Mm-hmm.
this funny. It's not just me cackling in a corner, I guess. But there's also this side where it is also depression humor, and I think that was part of modernizing it. They tapped into this very, I don't know, Gen Z millennial cusp humor where people make really dark, morbid, self deprecating jokes with an air of depression, often about very morbid things, but also in this constantly comedic humor to cope sense. Maybe that's actually not associated with the generation. Maybe that's something that has continued across time because that same air of the comedy is in the morbid humor is found in the book. They just over highlight it in this movie. They really take that as their main comedic beat. In regards to the question of would it be smart to read the source material before or after seeing it, you could do it either way. I will say when I read the book, it was like 5 bajillion years ago and I had forgotten most of it. So before the movie, I listened to the audiobook. It's actually pretty short. You can listen to the audiobook for free online, which is lovely, just a few hours, whatever. And that just kind of jogged my memory. And that is what then set me up to have the opinions that I'm giving now of like, this isn't that
Mm-hmm.
unfaithful of an adaptation, actually, if you consider like the tone of the book. The audiobook is also part of the reason I don't know how to pronounce any of the city names other than London that were mentioned in this. She says she'll watch it this weekend. If I can watch Bridgerton, I'm sure I'll at least like Persuasion. I would say that the Persuasion movie, I mean, like
Persuasion.
Bridgerton is not an adaptation of anything, but the Persuasion movie is certainly a better reflection of Regency era than Bridgerton, which is perfectly fine. Bridgerton's not trying to be like a faithful adaptation of like Regency stuff. It's trying to be a fun adaptation of Regency stuff, which
Mm-hmm.
is also great. And there's certainly space for that. Please continue for a million more seasons and certainly continue to improve upon the books. I guess Bridgerton is an
Yeah.
adaptation of the books. It's just not an
Yeah.
adaptation of a book that was written in Regency time. It's an adaptation of a book that was written in modern times about Regency times. I don't know. Is that a fair representation, Kate?
Yeah. Yeah. Most people are not distraught about the changes they've made in the adaptations from the book,
Mm-hmm.
whereas me and you on the flip side, are far more distraught about the adaptation differences between Bridgerton than we are about Persuasion.
I'm only
But
distraught when a like lack of faithfulness to the books
mhm,
is part of being cowardly. And we've
yeah,
highlighted certainly the instances in, well, both seasons of Bridgerton, but certainly most recently in the latest season of Bridgerton, where I felt, despite the fact that I love it, please renew it for a million years,
mhm,
so excited for Penelope's journey, blah 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 blah, the changes from the books were, in my opinion, cowardly. Likewise, if they don't choose to do some changes, for example, if they choose to keep all of the Bridgerton, all eight whatever of the Bridgerton romances straight, and they don't choose to change it, that likewise is cowardly. So sometimes a change is cowardly, sometimes a lack of change is cowardly. But those are the things where I'm like, you didn't take artistic risk. I'll give you one tiny example. It's my main critique. It's going to seem so small, where I thought a change was cowardly. And Kate, I think you already know what it is. It's the hand scene. Now, listen, stay with me. I know it sounds like we just want this because it was in Pride and Prejudice and it was just such an iconic moment. You literally don't even have to have watched the 2000 Pride and Prejudice to know what I'm talking about when I reference the hand scene and the hand clench like heard round the world, right? Where he helps her into the carriage. It's just such a good quintessential example of this sort of tense Regency romance where even the barest brush of fingers is enough to send somebody into a tizzy, right? Right. The thing is, that actually happens in this book. That doesn't even happen in Pride and Prejudice. What a fantastic change. 10 out of 10. So glad they added it. But it did actually happen in this book where he helps her into a carriage and they kind of make a big ado about it in the book, having recently reread it and then reread that exact moment to confirm that I wasn't crazy, that really was in the book. There's a moment in the book. It's a very sweet, if you get a chance to even just listen to a little bit of the audiobook or read a few pages of the book, it's a very cute, it's in chapter 10, where he helps her into a carriage when she is tired due to like a strenuous activity that just went on. He's not even getting into the carriage himself. He's just helping her into it. And, she goes away and there's like this whole, look into her inner monologue about him helping her into the carriage. It's very sweet. In the movie, I don't even think they have any contact. It's completely like brushed aside. It's not even a romantic moment. He's vaguely standing next to the carriage and like mentions to her that she should get in, but it's just extremely casual and it's not used as an opportunity to create a romantic moment or a tense moment or a sad moment or a happy anything. No emotion is evoked from that. And I know they were doing that because they were scared to replicate an iconic scene and just get dragged for filth online of like, oh, this is just copying Pride and Prejudice, blah, 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 right? But that was cowardly. They should have done it. They should have made a bold
mhm,
move to do it exactly as it's written in the book and boldly look like they're exactly copying the 2007 Pride and Prejudice. Or they can do a slightly different variation. They can do something that looks, silly but still romantic. They can do something that evokes much more sad or longing emotions. They can do something, whatever. But they did not. And that was cowardice. Kate, Do you
It's not
agree?
a
Please
count.
agree.
Well,
I'm
okay.
begging.
It's not a counterpoint, but it is a bit that I have to. I'll remind you of what actually happens in the scene. Instead of doing the handing in, they actually have Louisa make a comment about "don't be too prideful," which is a callback to the conversation she had just previously overheard, where Wentworth had called her prideful, and you can see that there's a moment where he wants to defend her against Louisa, which is kind of a contrast to the previous scene, because he can clearly see that she doesn't want to be in imposition. But I do agree that they could have had at least some larger call to what happens in the book. Yeah. I think they were trying to take that as an opportunity more to specifically address that there is some other opinions about her within the book, about how her reservedness and her decision to be loyal to her family to a point that then she kind of grows a little bit resentful of her family, and how that kind of appears in the public eye, and how she always holds herself to kind of be like the perfect person, that comes off very prideful, and so for her to want to avoid taking the carriage, Louisa kind of just nonchalantly makes the comment of "don't be too prideful, just get in the carriage," and it served a very different purpose. But I also agree you could have had something else romantic to stand in his place.
Did you feel like, in general, well, let me not ask you a leading question, but just know I have a leading question in my back
Mm-hmm.
pocket that I'm going to follow up with. Let me give you an open ended question. Were there any specific scenes or moments or whatever that you did dislike? With the understanding that I think we liked it more than 95% of people in the world. At least I did.
I don't think there was a specific moment or scene that I disliked. In fact, I was kind of looking to dislike it. I was looking to find something that really rubbed me the wrong way, and I couldn't find it. There were cheesy moments. There were quite hilarious moments. The moment where she calls out to him and he actually hears her, and then she spills the wine on her head. That was funny and totally unnecessary, but it was really funny. But uh, go ahead and lead me with this question because I'm coming up blank with what you're trying to hint at.
Okay. This is a leading question because this is clearly my perspective. Did
Mm-hmm.
you feel like the single flaw in the movie was just a slight lack of romance?
Yes,
Okay. Because
I.
obviously the carriage scene is my example of that because that's the one singular example, but in general I felt there were some moments, like opportunities where they could have given us just a smidge more romance along the way that they didn't. But I don't have a clear scene other than the carriage one where I'm like, this is the one that should have been added or changed.
Mm-hmm. I so I actually liked the beach scene where her and Frederick talk on the beach. It was kind of an amalgamation of all these different scenes. It worked really well. It was their water scene because all Jane Austen movies have to have some sort of water scene. And it was great. I liked it. Um, but that was really the only moment we kind of got in the middle of the movie that was truly just them talking, like being there with each other. And part of that obviously is that like slow burn, longing part of their relationship of the story. But it just could have been a little bit, I guess, more romantic, especially since my big issue with a lot of the complaints I've seen is that people are like, this is not a comedic book. I beg to disagree, but what I will agree with is that the argument that this is supposed to be her most romantic, her most sweeping novel, that
Mm-hmm.
it is without a doubt her most melodramatic. We were comparing her to Bella Swan in the best way possible
Yes.
about
Kindly.
how
Yes.
kindly about her inner monologue being very reminiscent of the Twilight monologues where she was like just like waxing and mooning about him for pages upon pages. Whereas in any other Austen novel, you get consideration, you get thoughts of the other person, but it's not the "oh my Frederick" for pages and pages and pages. And oh, the pain I am enduring because my Frederick is gone, pages and pages, which is no slight. It is just the difference. That is the one thing that's different about this book compared to the others. While it is melodramatic, it is very funny to me, but that's kind of its own thing. I appreciated the involvement of the comedy, of the humor in the movie, but it did kind of lack the iconic like longing and like kind of lusting over each other the entire thing. There wasn't enough of like silent stares across the room as we pan across. Like there wasn't enough long glances
I wonder
between the
how
two
they
of
could
them.
have generated that, because on the one hand, it seemed clear to me that this movie was trying to represent this sort of like post breakup depression or post loss depression, and how at least now and perhaps then, if we kind of read the between the comedic lines of the book, people coped with that with humor. And we have the actual like second chance love story of the book, but then we also have other kind of comparable or parallel love stories where we see a guy who is a widower find love again, and we see a girl who I think like one of the sisters is supposed to have originally liked somebody, and then now she likes somebody else, and blah blah blah. We see all of these kind of tales of like loss and finding love again, or her mentor, Lady Russell, lost and finding at least attention or romantic interest again, whatever the case may be,
Mm,
or in the case of her father, not finding love, whatever. Just this follow up, and in each case they represent their heartbreak differently, but the character that we're supposed to like attach to or relate to is the main character, right? And she represents her heartbreak and her loss frequently through kind of dry, depressive, sarcastic comments, right? And sort of these almost fake melodramatic claims, or flopping dramatically on the bed, but we're led to believe she
mhm,
doesn't really mean it. And that I think resonates in that probably reflects a lot of more modern behavior, at least of certain generations. I don't know, where people cope with what should be like a medium level inconvenience, with the humor you'd associate with a minor inconvenience, but the melodrama you'd associate with a heavy inconvenience, but never an appropriate medium response to a medium inconvenience, right? And thus it felt very modern. But in doing so, I felt like it did distance us from the romance, if unless they gave us some other romantic moments. And that's why I thought the carriage one would be fine, because it can kind of break through those walls she puts up, the walls of fake melodrama and the walls of, kind of the sarcastic, quippy, well, at least I'm the only funny person in the room type of vibe, right?
mhm,
Other than the carriage scene, I'm just not sure where they could have woven that in, but it would have certainly required her and her, love interest to have a little bit more one-on-one time, or even time in each other's presence. And they don't actually have a ton of one-on-one time in the book.
mhm. Yeah, I will say like I think it would just be generally harder on screen if they're trying to do something different. I haven't watched older adaptations. I'm sure that because there's less time focused on comedy and kind of analysis on other parts of the story, they are able to do the longing glances across the room to develop that sense of romance. Whereas here they kind of cut that down a lot. But I will say in the novel, yeah, you know about enough about him to like him in the novel, but it's all through her perspective. You don't get a lot of the general like perspective. You don't get a lot of seeing him in society other than the Musgroves and all them. So it's hard to get a clearer image of him as say compared to like Mr. Darcy, which we know very well what he's like, mainly because we get the wrong impression and then we get the correct impression of him throughout the story.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas within Persuasion, we really only ever get the evolution of how Anne feels about their kind of split, and her memories of him, and then how she sees him now, and then how she gets to have him back. Um, I will say, when you were kind of describing the melodrama and specifically like the witticisms of Anne and how she was like the wittiest person in the movie with very few exceptions, this is my leading question. Do you think that she in this adaptation was too much a Lizzie rather than an Anne?
No, and I'll tell you
Mm-hmm.
why. The reason why I felt like she came across as Anne is not because of her writing, but because of the writing for the character that carried this wonderful movie on her very tiny back, and that is Mary. Was it Mary? Was that her name? It was Mary.
Yeah, it was
Yes.
Mary.
With the presence of Mary, who is melodramatic non-ironically and funny non-ironically and silly and demanding and over the top and very much a representation of Lydia Bennet kind of combined with a little bit of Mary Bennet and all of that contrast against Anne's behavior made Anne look more toned down, more introspective. In fact, a lot of the times in the movie, just because of the way it was shot, we see a lot of what's essentially an ITM, like an in the moment where Anne gets to speak and we're, essentially believing it's like to a side camera and the other characters can't hear her and it's sort of shot with this suspend disbelief, this is what's going on here. Therefore, a lot of what Anne says in the movie, she's not actually saying. The actual dialogue she says to other characters is pretty minimal. The fact that she speaks very minimally to other characters, sometimes intentionally in other languages so that they can't understand, and in contrast to the amount of kind of over the top talking that Louisa and Henrietta and Mary and like everybody else does, that contrast makes her look less like a Lizzie, because Lizzie in Pride and Prejudice, she, like obviously she's around melodramatic, over the top people, but she's a talker. She enjoys talking. She enjoys making jokes. She enjoys interjecting into other conversations, not just listening without making comments. She has to hold herself back from making comments. And holds herself back. She makes those comments in her head in the book and in the movie. And they found a way, an interesting way, to represent her introspective, kind of like funny, I'm being melodramatic in my head, but I'm being like calm and collected on the outside. They found a way to represent it by allowing her to sometimes act flopping on the bed or talk directly to the camera. And we are told nobody else sees it. So it is her internal behavior. That's why I don't think that she's a Lizzie, even if she has some Lizzie
Yes.
tendencies on the inside.
Yeah. I kind of feel the same way. So when I saw it, I very much I can see the argument that people are making with Lizzie. And I can accept that maybe the concept of like she is a possible representation of what Lizzie would have been like had she not had the chance to rekindle with Darcy, or even like her future with Darcy, she becomes a little bit better at regulating like what I say in this moment to not cause strife or whatever, but she still has that like snappy humor in her head. And she still is the first to notice when things people are being hypocritical or whatever, what have you, nonsensical. I in the Austen lexicon of her heroines, you kind of have a split of there's the sensible ones and the sentimental ones. And I actually put Elizabeth in the sensible. She overall is typically led by thought. It is this one thing that happens that she is led by her emotions and is miscalculating the scenario. And because of that, you look at the more sensible ones, and they all have a very similar dry wit. Like they see a problem, they see a moment of hypocrisy or a just of over the top zealousness within other people, and they have that dry, quippy, like, oh yes, mother, kind of uh, way of handling things, whether that be speaking in Italian or what else, what have you. And I agree that then you add in the context that we're supposed to understand that when Anne is acting overly modern, overly honest, looking dead into the camera, doing very modern, like melodramatic things, that's more of a representation of the melodrama that she kind of just goes on and on about in the book. But how she would actually be behaving in the story would just be the kind of like, oh yes, Mary, and then speaks in Italian, just to kind of put up with Mary's shenanigans. And I kind of think that is truly fitting of the book. And if a bit of a creative interpretation of her, I still think it kind of represents her pretty well. People kind of like to describe Anne as a stick in the mud, and I'm like, she's not. She's very interesting, very mature, and very forward thinking, especially considering her past. That she doesn't have really a lot of resentment towards Lady Russell, who kind of was the main force in telling her not to marry him at first. And that takes a lot of maturity that at least Lizzie in some of the parts of the book might not have always had. And I think that some other key elements really distinguish those two characters, if not for the fact that they do have a similar tone of humor throughout the movies. Um, but I think that they did it really well distinguishing it, and I do understand the surface level kind of comparison.
Hmm. Well, Kate, I present to you a crossroads. We have 10 minutes left, and I was going to have us do 5 minutes each of what else we watched this week. However, I really enjoyed hearing thus far your theories on persuasion. So, if you would like to use your 5 minutes to give us a full persuasion thesis, I would totally not complain. Otherwise, I'm happy to hear about what else you watched this week. I just don't want to shortchange those 5 minutes, you know?
Mhm. Okay, I mean, the other thing I did watch was Only Murders, but while it was a great episode, I don't have much to comment on it. So I will kind of sum up everything I have to say with this. The
Okay.
movie itself was really good, if you were willing to let it be good. And I think the reason people don't like it is the same reason that people didn't initially like Emma of 2020. It did something that challenged how we initially view it. There's a reason why people don't even like the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice, is because they want the exact copy of the book, and you're never going to get that. It's always going to be an interpretation, a vantage point of the director and the people that work with the movie, and it's just going to be a version, a snippet of how this person initially interprets the book. Perfectly fine and acceptable. I always love seeing the different interpretations because it gives such a fresh vantage point to find a new aspect of Austin to pick out.
Hmm.
However, I think if there is any pitfall in this movie, it is the fact that it walked a specifically thin line, and sometimes they let that line get really fuzzy.
Hmm.
They didn't keep the rules that they had set up for how this movie was going to work strict. I've seen a lot of comments saying that this would have been better if they kept the modern language to her fourth wall breaks, and I kind of agree. If they had limited to the super melodramatic, like outward displays and her language and everything like that of modern sensibilities to be so like connected to her addressing the audience, I think it would have been to its own benefit. Um, and then on the other hand, I've also seen arguments saying that it was the wrong novel for this kind of adaptation. And I don't think so. I think it did really well, but I would also be willing to say that this type of adaptation would have been best received in a Northanger Abbey, which is arguably her most comedic story. It is her most youthful story. It has it has the most opportunities to do things like this, and I think people would have been far more accepting of it. But because this was supposed to be the romantic one, the one with the most sweeping storytelling, it's been kind of refuted because of that. And it's sad to see because it was so good to us. It was very funny. It had some great acting, some great interpretations of characters that while it might not have been how I first initially envisioned these characters, I am fully able to accept that this is a version of this character, much like how we accept that Lizzie from Lizzie Bennet Diaries is a interpretation of Lizzie, even if it's not how I initially read it when I read the book. So I just kind of wish, just like in any other fandom really, that we didn't have to like hate everything. We could
Yeah.
just like kind of mildly critique things that we don't love about it, and then if you don't like it, move on. And if you do like it, yay, you get another thing that you really like. So that's kind of how I felt about the entirety of the thing.
I really like a comment Stormy has in the chat where she asks, does it seem like critics are harder on shows and movies meant for women? Yes, absolutely. And I think even sometimes the tone of how something is critiqued right off the jump is, and this is why I was so obstinate about it, Stormy,
Mm-hmm.
is sometimes the tone is not just, oh, this is bad. It's, this is bad and you shouldn't like it and you're dumb if you like it. And that is what activated that obstinate in me. And I think to an extent, anything that is made where women's romanticism or women's romantic fulfillment or romance from a woman's perspective or whatever, anywhere where that's prioritized or put slightly center stage in any way, that is going to receive that level of critique. Like, you're dumb even just for having feelings. You're dumb even for wanting love. You're dumb for enjoying watching love. You're dumb for liking romance. And I just don't accept that. And I think if you put yourself in a position where you are open to enjoying romantic, pretty movies and not feeling bad about it, A, you're probably going to like this. B, you're probably going to get more enjoyment out of genuinely good like stories in general, because most really good stories, if they're truly tapping into all parts of the human experience, are going to tap into romance, and they're going to tap into it in a way that at least includes the female perspective in some way. So a
Mm-hmm.
story that has absolutely no level of romance or no level of female perspective on romance is probably not tapping into a broad part of, you know, like the human emotional spectrum. And this taps into one part of it, but I think it does it well if you're open to receiving it. And in doing so, it also taps into a wide range of men's experiences in the context of romance. We see a widower and he gets to explain his feelings, and all throughout the, you know, the feelings leading up to his romance, following his romance, the initial stage of potentially finding romance again and ultimately finding romance again. We get all of that. We get it from the male perspective. We get a romantic journey from a side character, a pretty far
Mm-hmm.
side character at that. They really take the time to take you on a pretty low stakes journey with these characters. It's a short movie, it's an hour and 45 minutes. It's deep topics, but they really don't get overly deep. And the movie doesn't really leave you, you know, feeling the need to cry at any moment or feeling like you were took on a journey that was too deep for what it's biting off. It's still a funny rom-com, but they still allow you to kind of tap into these little twinges of adjacency to humanity, which I think is very lovely if you are open to it. Carey in the chat says he just wants to drop in and say hello. He feels like he's back in English Lit. Kate, since we're back in class, I see your hand raised. Would you like to share something with the
Well,
class?
I was just waving to Carey, but I was just gonna kind of attack on to the comment about like like people liking to criticize the female kind of perspective the most. And I think that's kind of in every genre, sadly. So in other things we like to watch with WandaVision, me with Critical Role, with a bunch of other things that are not always specific to romance, anytime that there's a larger, more thoughtful like exploration of the human experience, of the human, like the humanity of life, the things that are far more in the morally gray, not because it's like evil or good or things like that. There's a, and I think part of it is because right now we're in such a like superhero movie culture where it's like you're good, you're bad. But there's such a presence of people criticizing or hating on characters or stories or experiences that are trying to tell a very like detailed and realistic and human story. And a lot of times it comes because it's a woman having realistic feelings and emotions and not always dealing with it in the way that everybody sees fit. whether that be romance, whether that be heartache, heartbreak, loss, growth of power, loss of power. All of these stories I've seen in very recent time being harshly criticized by people for very non-specific reasons, and it's all. And the reason I love it is because it's such a like detailed and nuanced exploration of this human experience. But because it doesn't fall within the lines of good, bad, there's such a like an attack on it, and I'm like, I just I get frustrated with that
Ultimately, at the
as
end of the
a
day, like
fan.
if an audience doesn't like something, they don't like something, life's too short, don't watch it, don't enjoy it, like it's totally
Mm-hmm.
fine. In this particular instance, I feel like a lot of what's leveraged at it is I think I'm not supposed to like this, or I think because this is
Yes.
modern, different, whatever, I shouldn't like this. I think this, I mentioned at the top, and you mentioned Only Murders in the Building. I think there's some really interesting examples of that there. We're going to have to save it for next discussion because I think we'll have a lot more to dive in by then because we'll be nearing the finale. I
Mm-hmm.
also mentioned Umbrella Academy, and there's a really good example of that in the latest season. Throughout the latest season, there's this really sweet romance, like very, very sweet. And it's between two characters that are portrayed as almost dumb. I don't know, kind of head in the clouds ish. And, this guy and this girl, they love each other. They fall in love. They have a wedding, even though the world's about to end. And they fight to save the world. It's so cheesy. It's very sweet. Every other character in the entire show is just rolling their eyes, thinking this is the dumbest thing ever. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. And the show, up until that point had a huge lack of female presence, perspective, etc. And the few, women that they did have and did have their perspective were pretty exclusively bad or terrible, with like the exception of like one like cutthroat, kind of anti-hero ex-villainess in black leather. And like I love her. She's a total cliche, but like I love her because she's like the cliche version of what I typically like. But this absolutely like soft, sweet, non-fighter female character, they came in and they really showed her perspective of her falling in love with this big, dumb, gentle giant. And I just found it fantastic because that was the human emotion that the show had previously not tapped into. They had not tapped into any like real, meaningful, sweet, kind of almost childish romance up until this point. They had kind of teased approaching it prior, but they never really did. And once they did, the whole show felt a lot more complete and a lot less like, a boys' club. We are 2 minutes over, Kate. And our next discussion will be almost all Only Murders in the Building because we keep bumping that to the next week's
Mm-hmm.
agenda. But I will see you, what will it be, August 10th in 2 weeks to chat about Only Murders in the Building, plus, everything else that we watched this week. Thank you for chatting with me. And more importantly, thank you for watching Persuasion with me so that I could enjoy
Mm-hmm.
it enough to have this experience.
It was a really fun, like, a great time.
Until next time, bye bye.
Bye.